Okay, now to talk about the books often called the Duristic history, especially Joshua and Judges. Some would lump, Martin Note especially, lump the Deuteronomy and Duristic history. I tend to talk about the history books as being separate. But there seems to be something going on, some sort of redactional layer or addition or something of Joshua, Judges, 1st, 2nd Samuel, 1st, 2nd Kings, that have been lumped together or gone through to have some sort of connection to Deuteronomy. There's a lot of the theology that overlaps. There seems to be some sort of influence going on here that's more so. There seems to be something setting Joshua, Judges, 1st, 2nd Samuel, 1st, 2nd Kings apart from, say, Exodus or Leviticus. There seems to be something different going on ideologically. Some say that these notions of ideology and theology reflect a reaction against or response to the Babylonian exile. There may be something going on. There seem to be two formative events going on, at least in the formation of the edition of the text that we have today. First off, we have the waning of the Assyrian control, and I've got a slide on this, the Neo-Assyrians, Neo-Babylonian influence. The two major empires in the ancient Near East around the time of Josiah, which is around the time, the last of the kings, so to speak, were the Neo-Assyrians and the Neo-Babylonians. Kind of like when I was a kid, there was the U.S. and the Soviets, the two superbloc nations. The Assyrians were waning control, and there seems to be something going on with Josiah's reforms, and possibly the book of Deuteronomy that's found, if some parts of Deuteronomy are found during Josiah's reign in 1 Kings 22-23, that these things seem to reflect the waning power of Assyria, where the Assyrians have been the overlords of Judah, the southern kingdom. Judah is now asserting more influence and more power, more cultural relevance to emphasizing their culture a little bit more over the culture of the Neo-Assyrians. And some of these reforms that Josiah enacts may have some anti-Assyrian element to them. And I've written papers on that. If you guys want to read that and bore you to tears, I'd be glad to send it to you. Let me know. Okay. Another major influence is the Babylonian exile. Once Assyria kind of wanes in power, the next big kid on the block are the Neo-Babylonians. And then they come along and they come in and they have different deportations and exiles, I guess you could say, of the best and the brightest from Judah. For example, the narrative of Daniel. Some people are deported in Daniel. The kind of the cream of the crust. Ezekiel is one of those who is deported, who ends up in the exile, and he seems to be from a priestly class of people. And they see these, and one of the things about Babylonian exile, it raised a bunch of questions. Now I've got a slide here of at least 12 questions. There was this notion, seemed to be this notion, if one, is reading the Hebrew Bible right, or the Old Testament right, is that there was a notion in some of the theology of Judah, of Israelites, that God dwelt in a certain place. And there seems to be a Zion theology where God dwelt in Jerusalem, in the temple. That was his house. It was his special city. Well, once the Babylonians destroyed Jerusalem, sacked Jerusalem, destroyed the temple, took away the sacred vessels, the sacred things. They didn't take the ark, apparently, because that ended up Indiana Jones, didn't it? Just kidding. Once the temple was destroyed, once the power base, the religion was changed, so to speak, what does it say about God? Where's God? Where's God going to live? In kind of the ancient Near Eastern thought, gods were tied to cities. Marduk was the chief god of Babylon. Ashur was the chief god of Assyria and Nineveh. Yahweh is the chief god of Judah. But guess what? There's no Judah. There's no temple. There's functionally no Jerusalem. What now? Is God powerful? Is God going to follow us? One of the things that pops up in the book of Ezekiel, especially in Ezekiel chapter 1, we'll talk about this, is this notion of the chariot with all the wheels that go different directions, and kind of the joke is that they're spinners, the rims of the spinners. Part of that multi-directional thing, that the moving chariot, is that God is not just bound to Judah and Jerusalem. God goes with his people to Babylon. But scholars theorize Duristic history seems to be influenced by a lot of these questions that pop up in the exile. And those 12 questions I have in that slide, identity, guilt, theodicy, is God just? Divine presence, divine power, idolatry, syncretism. Syncretism kind of, melding things together, blending things together, making things look the same and similar. Questions of purity, questions of continuity and change, beginning and again, leadership, all those things pop up in some idealistic history and seem to be resulting from some traumatic influence of the exile. And it seemed to be written by those who were in the exile as opposed to those who were in Babylon, as opposed to those left in Judah. It seems to be a different crop that pops up. Overview of Joshua. I've got a slide here from Banstra's article in the HarperCollins Bible Dictionary. It's a really good summary of the book of Joshua. There's a few people named Joshua, but this figure that seems to be the main figure in the book of Joshua is the figure that pops up in the Torah, Joshua, son of Nun. It seems to be the next in line after Moses. So there's some historical and theological dilemmas. First off, the notion of holy war is a genocide. That's one thing that pops up in discussion. And I have a Hebrew word in there in English script, H-E-R-E-M, herem, which means banned or set apart or sacred. Herem law, holy war. God instructs the total annihilation of different people groups and population. It seems to be a problem. Jesus said, love your enemies, right? Well, there was a fellow in the early centuries, AD centuries, I should say, in a Christian context, Marcion, who saw the God of the Old Testament, especially the acts of holy war, as showing that there's a different God of the Old Testament than the New Testament. Marcion, this is around the time the New Testament came together, Marcion had his own version of the New Testament and included essentially Luke and a few writings of Paul because the rest of them are viewed too Jewish, too much like that Old Testament God who's not the God of the New Testament. The New Testament God's a God of love. The Old Testament God's a God of Alzapia. That's layman's terms, I guess, right? Some things to think about, in this notion of this genocide is, the war in the ancient world, and even today, war is a brutal thing. Especially in light of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, soldiers come back not only with visible scars and loss of appendages, what have you, but the rise of PTSD, what they used to call in World War II, what have you, is shell shock. It's a horrific thing. War is brutal. Even back then, it was brutal. It was even more so brutal. Another thing to take note of is that, God is the one who judges. It's not our place to judge. Another thing to take note of is that holy war, is it the norm or is it the exception? And I think in some ways this is the exception of the story. Now I have a really good quote here by Collins. I'll let you guys read that, and it's in a way of answers. And he says no definite answers can be given to the question, but a few suggestions can be offered. So some things to think about. Another historical or theological dilemma when it comes to Joshua Judges, especially Joshua, is this notion of the archaeological evidence that scholars have uncovered does not necessarily line up with the account of Joshua. For example, Jericho doesn't even seem to have been settled population-wise at the time the book of Joshua is portrayed to have occurred. Some items may fit. For example, Hatzor is a dig site, a city. The date and destruction seem to fit. The story of Jericho and Joshua may have existed in mythic memory, used for literary purposes, some scholars theorize. The lack of true history doesn't mean the story isn't untrue. Some scholars view Joshua as fictive in a sense that, impact of events may have not occurred in the exact certain way, but it's kind of sticking to the gist of the story. Ancient historiography, like, for example, Herodotus, the Greek historian, they recount a dialogue that no one could have heard, that seemed to be made up. In fact, a lot of the dialogue moves the narrative of the history that Herodotus tells, and the main reason is that it fits the kind of the story the way a historian weaves it. Whether you want to admit to it or not, even modern day historians to some degree, they create a story, they weave the telling of data to make a point. And ancient history in some ways did that. It weaved a story, weaved a narrative based around the data, emphasizing some things, maybe ratcheting up, decreasing, what have you, There seems to be some notion of this going on in Joshua. Whether it is mythic memory or whether it's actual history, I'll leave it up to you to debate and to look into. For me, it's a faith issue in some ways. Maybe when I get to heaven and see Joshua, I'll ask him, right? But there seems to be something going on here that doesn't necessarily line up. And in Old Testament scholarship, you have maximalist and minimalist. It's kind of the pejorative categories come up with. Maximalists seem to look at everything in the Old Testament for the most part as being historical. It actually happened this way. And that's kind of a caricature there. But the minimalists, and a caricature notion here too, the minimalists seem to see every bit of history in the Old Testament for the most part is not really happening that way. It was made up by later people to explain their origin story. And I think both camps are a little too to the extreme. I think there's a little bit of a medium here, especially the minimalist. Anyway, a third issue that arises in Joshua judges the importance of point of view. There are implied shifts here. There are unexpected characters that are favored. For example, the Rahab is favored. The outsider I mentioned in a previous lecture. She is of the land. She's not an Israelite. Yet she's taken into the fold. In fact, she even pops up in Jesus' genealogy in Matthew. There's several Gentiles in that genealogy. There's several women in that genealogy. Rahab's one of them. Inclusion of all into God's kingdom, right? Okay? There's several theories of how the Israelites came into the land. The scholars have come up with. Most of them disagree with how it's depicted in Joshua. As some sort of kind of quick into the land, destroy, get in the land. Although Joshua's kind of divided as a book as to how it seems to be portrayed. There seems to be something going on quickly, and then slows down. Get the judges, and it seems like nothing really ever happened at all. Anyway, the first model is the immigration model, and I have a summarization there. It seems to be that people, kind of migrated from one part of the land into the other. There's the conquest model. Kent Richards writes about that. I got a quote there from him. This kind of seems to be close to the notion that one finds in the book of Joshua. There's some issues with that. And I have a few other quotes here talk about the notion of chosen, the conquest of Canaan there, the two articles there. That's the revolt model. I'm sorry. The revolt model is essentially is a lower class versus upper class revolt going on here, and that seems to be something going on here. Canaanite peasants are revolting against the upper crust, and to me that has too much of a Marxist tinge. I don't know. Another model that pops up is the gradual emergence theory. That seems to be kind of just a gradual rise of city-states, what have you, from the people there. And I got the quote there from Collins to explain that. I present the data to you. These are theories that scholars have come up with to try to explain, and these are trying to explain, what may have happened and they're trying to explain it because there's a rub between the archaeology and the text. Now, 10 years from now, 100 years from now, somebody may find something that says big old newspaper or a sign that says Joshua was here this year, this day. Until then, we conjecture, right? We can conjecture. Joshua 6, there's some issues surrounding the taking of Jericho. And first, is the historical question. This issue of, doesn't archaeological evidence doesn't line up? Another question that's brought up here is the question about its character. Should be read as ordinary history or as an edifying legend? That's something to take note of. And I've got the quote there from Conville from his Two Horizons commentary. Now to Joshua 7, the holy war, the harem notion here. Harem is to utterly destroy. And there's some issues going on here with the destruction of peoples and groups. In fact, there's a story of Achan where he's told the parties to destroy everything, don't take anything. He takes some stuff. He's killed and his family's stoned. It's very brutal. There's some things to think about on that slide there. Now, Joshua 23 through 24, Joshua functions much like a Moses farewell address in Deuteronomy 31, 33. It sets up the covenant renewal at Shechem in Joshua 24. And this covenant renewal contrasts with disobedience seen in Judges' next book, kind of a transition from one story to the next. Kind of like in Genesis and Exodus, there's a bit of a transition there where it's a little rough, but there's a transition, right? Now to judges. Now, when one considers the officer position of a judge, it's not somebody sitting on a bench in a robe. It's more of a tribal chieftain in the Old Testament sense here. National leaders, if you will, or group leaders. There were Joshua and Judges were national leaders, and there's kind of a division amongst the tribes or people groups based off these sons of Israel going on here. And there's some of these different figures that arise, and most of the little narratives or vignettes in Judges focuses around these judges. I've included a slide in here, the summary of Banster's article there, the book of Judges, a really good summary of kind of the overstructure of of Judges. It mentions some of the main figures that pop up. These main judges: Ehud in chapter 3, Deborah in 4 and 5, Gideon in 6 and 8, Jephthah in Judges 10 through 12, and Samson in 13 through 16. And there seems to be a cycle going on in Judges, especially in chapter 2. There's kind of a laying out of the cycle. It's a broken record type cycle. If you're familiar with vinyl records, how you kind of skip and skip and skip and skip. I used to hate that as a kid. The Israelites, they fail to be obedient to Yahweh. They worship other deities. They become oppressed by a neighboring nation state or a person or what have you. They call out to God. God sends a judge or leader to deliver them. And then again, the phrase pops up here, the Israelites again did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. There's some variation sets up this cycle, because it happens a lot. And I put the citations there for Judges 2, 3, twice in 3, 4, 1, 6, 1, 10, 6, 13, 1, where it kind of seems that cycle seems to be repeating. This repetitive notion of they sin, God delivers them, they sin back again. It's very repetitive. Summary of the death of Samson, Judges 16, 23 through 31. And I put in there a little quote from D.A. Carson's New Bible Commentary there. It's one of the things about the death of Samson, and get into it's an interesting story, which, by the way, Samson is very much a Hercules type figure, and some scholars have even conjectured that there seems to be some interplay between the Hercules myth and legend, Greco-Roman mythology, and the Samson story. I don't know. It could have just been that archetype that was out there in the ancient world. Could be. But Samson is a strong figure. He's blinded. He wants revenge. He's sinned and everything. You probably know some of the story, but I love the last part, the death story here, where he's at this temple. He's been taken captive by the Philistines, the people of the land, who've come in, the sea peoples, essentially. And he goes to he's a temple of Dagon. He swings two pillars. He gets his strength back just for a little bit. He's lost his strength because of a haircut previously. The story of Delilah, if you're familiar with that. You probably heard it. Even if you hadn't read the Bible, probably heard that. Pushes on the pillars, falls down, and what have you. Interesting story. It ends where it began. Samson was taken home and laid to rest by his family. So anyway, thank you.